have we reached a threshold of effectiveness in the U.S. bombing of ISIS and similar terrorist groups, right? Enemies of civilization, all the way, nothing to be done but the use of force. Very sorry. This is the way it is. Regretfully, but this is the way it is. And they've been created by the U.S., Saudi Arabia, NATO intelligence, but it's like Hitler. Once the Frankenstein monster is coming at you, you've got to do something about that. Now, I'm going to just try to mix in two elements here. You remember that Kerry has a track record. Kerry's track record is that if we go back to June of 2013, Kerry was demanding an immediate attack on the forces of Assad. Remember this? And interestingly, it was occasioned by a development on the ground. The fall of Qusair, the city of Qusair, near the corner of Syria that faces Lebanon, key pathway for logistical deliveries and so forth by the various corrupt pro-Western political elements in Syria. We don't need to go into who they were. But the idea was that probably the biggest single military turning point of the entire Syrian civil war is when the Assad forces, backed up by Hezbollah, took over Qusair and kicked out the various terrorists. At that point, different mix of organizations, but that was the idea. Within a couple of days, Kerry was demanding the bombing, and you'll remember we focused on this quite a bit when it happened. There was a clash then between Kerry and General Dempsey. And General Dempsey said, you don't know what you're doing. You don't have an entrance strategy. You don't have an exit strategy. You don't seem to realize that this would require the complete destruction of the entire Syrian air defense system and landing fields and all the rest. And then Kerry was rebuffed. Notice he did it in a meeting where Obama was not there, and he demanded immediate bombing of Syria in a meeting where Obama was absent. And that seems to be the idea, except this time Obama is even more absent. He's on one of the longest trips of his presidency. He's out of touch. Therefore, I would say to Obama, watch out. The mice are playing, right? When the cat's away, the mice will play. These are not mice. These are monsters of warmongering. And let's just also see this other angle. When Dempsey was talking to Kerry back in June of 2013, Dempsey said, look, do you realize what you're asking for? We would have to wipe out the Syrian Air Force, air defense, radars, missiles, and all that. At that point, Dempsey said, that's at least 700 sorties. Go back and look. Now, what we've got now, as of the 24th of October, and I'm sorry I can't find this. There's nobody who publishes this stuff. We don't have the ISIS sortie count. But by 24 October, 6,600 sorties, most of them fueling, refueling, and reconnaissance. But of those, 632 sorties were actual airstrikes with 1,700 bombs. And it looks like it's taking a toll. They almost killed one of the top people. They did kill some last week. Maybe that's the trigger. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we're following the attempted war coup triggered by, on the one side, the new power of Republican warmongers in Washington. You'd think that would have been an issue in the election campaign. I tried to make it an issue. arrest McCain for ISIS. Not just warmongering, but warmongering against a Frankenstein that you yourself have created. And on the other hand, the fact that the cumulative effect of the U.S. bombing, despite the scorn heaped on this by the reactionaries, the defeatists, and those who actually want a wider war, they say bombing isn't enough. We demand the ground troops. Well, Operation Inherent Resolve has had significant effects. So 632 of these air sorties were actual bombing runs. 1,700 bombs dropped. Heavy casualties for ISIS around Kobane. We're going to see a program on Friday night. By the time you hear this, you'll have to go and look for it in the archives. But on MSNBC, Richard Engel, dubious character, but he's been in Kobane with the Kurds, and he's been interviewing. So Engel will by now have said what he's going to say, and it's going to be interesting because if he plays up the bravery of the Kurds against ISIS, that ISIS can be defeated, can be killed, then maybe some wind is blowing, right? Different factions choosing sides on this attempted war coup, I would guess by Kerry, McCain, and their various cohorts. But now, let's look at some of the answers. There was testimony on Capitol Hill yesterday, and here the usual team, Hagel and General Dempsey. Hagel wearing a Band-Aid on his left cheek. Did somebody slug him? Did Susan Rice come at him with a stiletto? I don't know. But this is a very interesting clarification. According to this, Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel shot down reports that the Obama administration is considering a change of targets in its fight against the Islamic State. And this you can get on Al Monitor, the Middle East source. So he is asked by Jackie Speier, Democrat of California. She is interestingly against training and equipping the Syrian democratic terrorists, right? The wonderful Free Syrian Army of Terrorism, interchangeable in a moment's notice with al-Nusra and or ISIS or anything else. Hagel says, Assad is part of the equation, of course, but just alone dealing with Assad where we are now, that's not going to put ISIS, the Islamic State, back into the box. And it turns out that the substance, we have a memorandum from Hagel which talks about these same things, right? This goes back to early October. So there's a memorandum from Hagel to Rice, early October, saying the U.S. Syria policy is incoherent. Now, much of the coverage of that memo had tried to portray this as Hagel saying, we've got to attack Assad as well. And it turns out, in reality, it is the opposite of that. He has said the opposite of what many of the warmongers wanted him to say. Getting back to the hearings yesterday, Thursday, the 13th of November, he says, actually this article, and this is Al Monitor, Hagel wrote a sharp memo to Susan Rice last month urging a sharper focus, sharp, on solving the year-long conflict in Syria. But he says the Islamic State is the main target. Quote, we could change Assad today, and that's not going to change all the dynamics. Who are you going to replace Assad with? What kind of an army can take on ISIL? There is an operational planning conference this week. This is another trigger for these events. an operational planning conference at the Central Command headquarters in Tampa, Florida this week. 190 military planners from 30 nations laying the groundwork on how to deploy forces against the ISIS people. And then he does go on to say, look, the position of the United States remains that Assad has lost the legitimacy to govern. But there is no purely military solution to the conflict in Syria. Alongside our efforts to isolate and sanction the Assad regime, our strategy is to strengthen the moderate rebels, and on and on. All right, so this is extremely interesting. And let's think about what we might compare this to. Well, there is the famous moment in March 1999, the wounded Clinton, having just escaped conviction after being impeached, was skeptical about, as we reported it at the time, skeptical about bombing Serbia. But Al Gore gave the order while the Russian Prime Minister Primakov was flying across the Atlantic. He turned back when he got that news, and the possibility of a negotiated solution was out the window. It could have been had then as it was had later. That's one. But I'm thinking of another one, an even more horrendous one from the U.S. point of view, at least. And that is the infamous Cable 243. This is the cable that was issued by Averell Harriman, also of Skull and Bones, Kerry, Skull and Bones, Averell Harriman. This is August 24th, 1963, just before the Kennedy assassination. And it is a cable that was written principally by W. Averell Harriman, Roger Hilsman, and Michael Forrestal, a stooge of this faction, right, having this family heritage. President Kennedy was on vacation at Hyannis Port, and Defense Secretary McNamara on vacation, even CIA Director John McCone, for whatever that's worth, on vacation. This was the one Kennedy put in after kicking out Allen Dulles. So Kennedy is at Hyannis. Forrestal calls and says, we want to put out a cable, in effect, encouraging the military in South Vietnam to have a coup, right? To overthrow President Diem, kill his brother, and set up a military dictatorship. Kennedy says to Forrestal, speaking for Harriman, wait until Monday. We'll get everybody back to Washington. But Forrestal says Harriman wants to get the cable out right away. Kennedy then said, get it cleared by somebody else. Harriman and Hilsman recruit other State Department officials. They send it out. They do it behind Kennedy's back. And the result is within a couple of weeks, the assassination of Diem. That's the moment when the U.S. lost the Vietnam War. Skull and Bones Harriman, Skull and Bones Kerry. Beware. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We've reviewed and we will continue to review the tremendous success of the Tax Wall Street Party and Tax Wall Street United Front Against Austerity inspired candidates. If you find that a national destiny appeals to you, don't hesitate to get in touch with me directly. Go to tarpley.net. You should be going there anyway every day to catch up with all sorts of things. You can follow the Twitter from there. But in particular, go to the Speakers Bureau feature. And there's a contact device in there, right? You can contact me, send it on in. It goes direct to me. And if you're interested in running for office, you want to volunteer for other supporting other candidates. You want to be a campaign manager. You want to be a media director, whatever you want to be. This is all purely volunteer. This is to promote the survival of the United States and the world. Regretfully, but this is the way it is. And they've been created by the U.S., Saudi Arabia, NATO intelligence, but it's like Hitler. Once the Frankenstein monster is coming at you, you've got to do something about that. Now, I'm going to just try to mix in two. Have we reached the threshold of effectiveness in the U.S. bombing of ISIS and similar terrorist groups, right? Enemies of civilization, all the way, nothing to be done but the use of force. Very sorry. This is the way it is. Elements here. You remember that Kerry has a track record. Kerry's track record is that if we go back to June of 2013, Kerry was demanding an immediate Lebanon key pathway for logistical deliveries and so forth by the various corrupt pro-Western political elements in Syria. Attack on the forces of Assad. Remember this? And interestingly, it was occasioned by a development on the ground. The fall of Qusair, the city of Qusair, near the corner of Syria that faces